All right, so we are live. Fortunate today to have Mr. Bill Randolph, who now works. We'll get to where he works in a little bit, but back during the development of Ultima 9, he was the lead programmer on the project, at least for a few years of its development. It's very story development that we're going to hear about from him. So, hi, Bill.
Hey, good to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. So, I guess the obvious leading question: what brought you into video games in the first place?
That's a really long story, but I'll try and keep it short. Was a I was a programmer who had specialized kind of in scientific and engineering software, and I was working for a company that did speech recognition, and we got a contract to help a guy named Jay Patel at Interplay put speech recognition into his Star Trek game, the Star Trek 25th anniversary game. So I flew out to California to help with that and met Jay, and we hit it off. And I got to thinking, this guy, he makes games for a living. That seems really cool. And so I started looking into that and found out, hey, you actually can do this. So I talked to a recruiter and ended up getting a job at Westwood Studios in Las Vegas.
Okay, so you would have been working on the Command and Conquer games most likely then.
Yep. Yes, I ended up being a lead on the first Command and Conquer, the DOS version.
Fond memories, many fond memories. So that's Westwood, and they were eventually bought by EA, as was Origin. So what led you to join Origin? How did that jump happen?
Um, my time at Westwood, I was there for I guess 3.5 years or so, and I had been doing a lot of network programming, and I was just kind of tired of that. I wanted to move on to something else, and I also wanted more of a leadership role. And so I shopped around and found out that Origin was looking for a lead programmer, um, and they were located conveniently in my home state of Texas. And so I thought, well, that isn't too big of a leap, so I took them up on it and ended up as a lead on Ultima 9.
Wow. Were you at all familiar with the Ultima games before joining the team?
Yeah, I had played Ultima 3 and Ultima 4 on my Amiga and loved those games. They were some of the first RPG games that I had ever played, and so I was thrilled to be able to participate in the Ultima franchise.
Nice. So, did you then just jump right into the lead program role? There was no sort of introductory role uh, predating that?
I was hired directly as a lead, and what had happened was Ultima 9 had a long history before I got there that I didn't know about. Um, it had been through a couple of different iterations already, and its current state, right before they talked to me, was it was canceled. They had taken everyone off of Ultima 9 and put them onto Ultima Online. And Ultima Online, of course, being one of those MMO games, took a giant amount of resource for it to ship. Um, but Ultima Online was kind of getting stable and closer to being done, and they had some resources. And a guy named Mike McShaffrey, who I believe you know, he took the Ultima code and got it running with a 3D effects card. And so the game was 3D at that time, but with a software renderer. He got it working with 3D effects and kind of showed it to some people and renewed interest in the project. And so they decided, yeah, we'll go ahead and start this up again. And they put together a very small team, and they hired me in to be the lead. And at that time, they decided that Mike McShaffrey would not be a part of that team, which was, I'm sure, heartbreaking for him. I don't know what the story was for that, but they did decide to make a change in leadership.
Okay. Yeah, actually, Mike and I did talk a little bit about his involvement with Ultima 9. I can't recall if he got into too much depth. I do recall him giving me his vision for the story, which I really, really liked. Thought it was really cool what he had in mind for that. Okay, so you became lead programmer about summer '97. That would have been just before Ed Del Castillo made the jump as well, I guess, from Westwood.
Hmm.
What did you work on specifically where Ultima 9 was concerned? Like, what is a lead programmer? What would he have done?
Well, initially, my role as lead involved ramping up on all the tech that was already in the game. And just so you know, that the engine was still the Crusader Ultima 8 code. It had just been iteratively worked on to become 3D and had been kind of top down. Although it was 3D, it was the camera angle was top down. And when I arrived, it was at the point where they had just decided to make the camera like a free form camera. You could look around and over the shoulder view. So you would walk into buildings and the roof of the building would pop off, even though you were, in a 3D view. Um, and that was the state that the code was in at that time. And there was a lot of tech in there, a lot of very old tech. And so it took me a while to ramp up on that and start working on scheduling things and try to figure out how to move this forward. That took the majority of my time. And then I went into hiring mode where we started hiring other people, other programmers. Um, Eventually, I did take on coding responsibilities. I did the lighting system that we eventually shipped with. And I did some of the AI, which was super fun to work on. And I did the world movement, which was quite difficult. It came out okay. Generally, it worked pretty well. Swimming was always a big problem. Oh my gosh. But yeah, I think those are the main systems I worked on.
Just to clarify, when you say world movement, are you talking about like just how
How
monsters
creatures moved
move?
around the world. For example, the Avatar would walk and how he did collision detection
Uh,
and how you would detect when you have run up against a wall that you can't go through versus you've just hit a tree stump that you can step up onto. When you would fall and when you would slide. Uh, for swimming creatures, how they navigated through water, and when you were the Avatar, how you navigated through water, or in most cases failed to navigate. Um, and for flying creatures, how they flew through the air.
okay. And then yeah, you mentioned the swimming as well, which was always a little bit. It was an interesting system, but it did have its quirks.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, you were kind of right during the transition from that isometric top-down viewing angle to the over-the-shoulder. Okay, and actually that addresses a couple of questions kind of all at once. In that, because you also mentioned, it had been built on the legacy code from the Crusader engine. And did that translate through all the way to the shipped version of the game? Is what we have at Ultima 9 still in some way, does it still have bits and pieces of like that old Crusader code base in there?
Yeah, there are bits and pieces of Crusader in there. I can't really quantify how much. I
Hmm.
know that the code definitely made reference to Crusader and to Ultima 8. Um, some of the systems in the code that weren't necessarily related to rendering or 3D or movement or things like that, but yeah, there definitely were elements of that in there all the way up till when we shipped. And there were, I'll probably get into this more later, but there were parts of the code that the code base was so big, it was too big for all of us to be able to manage. There were things in there we didn't even know until we were in QA. There were features in the game we didn't even know about that had been put there by programmers generations prior to us.
We'll have to come back to that. I know I have a question coming up a little bit about features in the game. Um, but just before we kind of leave the engine behind, Actually, there's one more question after this too. Do you think it might have been a better idea to start from scratch, to build a new engine from scratch, or would that have been entirely too time and cost prohibitive?
Well, I will say the short answer is absolutely yes. We should have started from scratch. Absolutely. There was never a time on the project when we had the political clout to be able to tell the company, you know what, we're going to start clean. The project had been through multiple iterations, and even though I wasn't there for those, just the company never would have gone for a complete fresh start with the code. That would have been viewed as a complete disaster. But and I spoke this, I expressed this sentiment multiple times on the project that while we started with this code base that basically worked and had a lot of features, and every milestone along the way we added more functionality and swapped out code, there was never a time when we looked at a piece of functionality or a milestone and said, yes, this is clearly a time when we need to rewrite everything. But if you looked at where we started and where we ended up, clearly the right thing to do would have been to rewrite everything. That was just so clear. And that's a conundrum with a lot of software development, is at what point do you just pull the plug and say, nope, this has to be done, clean. Sometimes you reach that point.
Fair enough. This may actually be related then to ask. You mentioned already that at the time you had joined, the move to 3dfx had been made, but it was still all software rendered. Of course, another big milestone in Ultima 9's development was the jump to the hardware accelerated 3D, which meant it was a glide rather than D3D, which was the DirectX version of N 7.
I think we were on 6.
Okay.
In fact, when we first started, we might have been using 5.
Okay. Now, obviously, Glide didn't last. D3D did. Looking back, do you think that it's easy to say, from the historical perspective, well, obviously Glide wasn't the best choice. But, looking back at the time, do you think that was the right choice?
So let me tell you that story. If you look at the time frame of when we were in development with Ultima 9, from like 97 to 99, and if you look at the hardware advances that were made in that period, a revolution occurred in the entire industry during that time. Early 97, late 96, I think, was when 3dfx took off. And I don't know exactly how they achieved their market penetration. I think they had Quake and they had Tomb Raider, and they achieved a lot of penetration that way, and I think they gave out a lot of cards to developers. And that swung a lot of people over, including Origin, to doing stuff using 3D hardware. Direct3D was kind of a backwards child at that time. It couldn't do all the things that 3dfx could do. It was harder to use than Glide. But during Ultima 9's development, Microsoft had polished it to the point and had been enough of an evangelist with game developers to get them to adopt it, where the scales tipped, and Direct3D was the winner in terms of adoption, not in terms of technical ability. Not in terms of technical ability. Direct3D was it worked really well on the higher end cards, like the TNT cards, but there were a whole lot of cards who said, yeah, we're a 3D card, we're a Direct3D card too, and they were horrible. But what they were designed to do is run Quake efficiently, and so Quake was the milestone for all games at that time. The frame rate that your card got running Quake was how you were measured as a 3D card. That didn't make you a good 3D card. It just meant you could run that one game and that one engine well. And they would actually put in optimizations specifically for Quake so that it would run their game faster. And those cards, it fell to us that we had to support those cards alongside the 3dfx family of cards. So we ended up shipping with Glide, which was kind of our reference implementation. And then we had to attack the Direct3D problem about I think we really aggressively addressed it about halfway through my time on Ultima 9. Spent just over a year really working on that. But it just, you know how it's hard to sell the company on rewriting all the code? Well, all of the art was developed with a software renderer. And the art was totally not optimized for Direct 3D, especially those lower-end cards that were meant to run Quake well. The way that Quake art was done, it optimized its use of textures very heavily, and it swapped textures very infrequently. Our game was the opposite. There were so many textures involved. For example, you've probably seen breakouts of the avatar himself. I don't know how many textures there were just to render the avatar, maybe 16 different textures. That's fatal in a direct 3D card of that day, swapping states that many times just to render one object. And we had a lot of different textures. And so for a software renderer that's free, for Glide it was minimal impact, and for Direct 3D it was horrible. So yeah, we would have had to redo the art, and we knew that in order to get decent performance out of Direct 3D, and we brought that up, like, hey, what do you think the chances are we could, redo all the art? And that didn't go over very well.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, art is a pretty significantly expensive piece of game development, especially for 3D.
Yep, but that was part of what happened during that revolution. Was software renderer, here's a certain way you can make your art. Direct 3D hardware, radical change, complete different art pipeline.
That probably also explains why the resolution of textures varies so wildly in the game. I know there's a few people who've been poking away at the engine over the years, and I think it supports up to like 256 by 256 pixel textures, but on some of the plants and other objects, they've found textures with resolutions as low as 64 by 64. Then the comment has always been that sort of really inconsistent, actually, texture resolutions across many of the objects in the game.
I think that on the NPCs we emphasized higher resolution textures. We just wanted them to look really good, and we implemented MIP mapping. But I think for some of the objects it was just perceived that it wasn't worth it, and so they never really resed them up.
Okay. Yeah, that would make sense, because the NPCs actually did look really good for the time. They hold up not too badly today, I think. Guess a plant isn't quite as important. Over the years, a lot of cut content has come to light about the game. This is actually true of a lot of different Ultimas, but systems and features that were removed from Ultima 9 during its development. And the assumption has kind of always been that this has been because of whether it was difficult to implement those things, or there was just not enough time to implement them.
Mm-hmm.
To take one example, there's a glitch in the game where I believe it's just after you get rescued from the dungeon wrong, Raven, the pirate lady, gives you your equipment back. But sometimes your sword is actually it's in her hand. It's equipped on her character model, as though she had an inventory slot there. It was rumored that there was supposed to be a party system with inventory management at one point. Do you recall this feature at all? Had it been cut before your time, or was that one of the things that got the axe during your tenure?
Well, I can speak to the party system. I don't know if the inventory glitch you're describing is related to that or not. It's entirely possible. When it comes to that code base, I will just say anything could be in there. Anything. In terms of party inventory management, I don't recall there being a specific system for that. So I don't know why she would have had it equipped in her hand. It could have easily just been a bug. Who knows? The party system was cut. I remember the meeting that we had when that decision was made. Um, and looking back, I regret that. I wish that we had not done that. But at the time, we were so overwhelmed with technology and problems and trying to keep the game moving forward. There were a lot of technical issues with having a party. There was performance. Having that many NPCs like always with you was going to be a performance problem. There was pathfinding. We had enormous problems with pathfinding. Because our game was a free-form 3D world. It was a polygon soup. We didn't have any kind of sorting of or structural containers to like quad trees or anything to help us sort through the polygon soup. We didn't. I don't think any game at that time had invented the concept of having a walkable surface, which is where you simply flag certain polygons as your feet go here. That would have solved so much if we had only thought of that. It would have been a huge amount of work to do, but if we had thought of that, that would have solved so much. So we just had enormous problems just getting NPCs to pathfind, even around in their tavern. Can you walk around the counter and go to this table? Sometimes they would walk over it, and you would walk into the bar and see the guy standing on top of the bar. It's like, what are you doing up there? Um, yeah, so we made and I remember I had an idea for pathfinding for parties that I threw out there as just kind of a joke. It was like, well, maybe they can pathfind just trying their best, and if you lose them, maybe when your camera looks away and you look back, they'll just be there. We'll just teleport them to be with you. And everyone laughed, and you know what? There were games that shipped way after we did that exact thing. That your NPC companions get stuck and they just teleport to you. That's okay. It would have been okay if we had done that, but we just could not solve those problems. And so I think it was Richard who was kind of on board with, well, let's just cut the party. We don't really need it.
So that would probably have also been why NPC scheduling was cut then, pathfinding issues.
NPC scheduling, that was partially due to pathfinding, but it was also due to, let me think, this was a long time ago.
15 years.
I recall that we had problems stuffing all the data that we needed into the items in the world. That when we cached out a section of the world, we had to save it and persist it. And then when you went back near that area, it would cache back in and reload those objects. And the amount of data that we had per object was a very fixed amount. That system was designed with rigid constraints based on Windows chunk size on its file system, and expanding it would have been a giant amount of work. So we ran out of room to store data for things like NPCs. We lost the ability to remember who owns an object. Which NPC has ownership of the dagger sitting on the table? Can you walk into the tavern and just take that dagger? If we had that concept of ownership, we could have had the NPC say, hey, don't take that. That was a typical behavior of certainly Ultima 7 and RPGs of that era, but we lost that. And NPC scheduling fell into that category, I think. We just didn't have the data to support it, and yeah, it would have been a development effort that I don't think we were willing to spend time on either.
Okay. It's kind of a... Actually, that leads into another question. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Because while it didn't have a party system, and it didn't have NPC scheduling, Ultima 9, its 3D engine nevertheless did include a lot of features, a number of things that were really unique in 3D RPGs. Specifically, especially the interactivity in the world. In most 3D games, this barrel sitting over here, well, that's just a static object, and it's got a baked light map, and you can't do anything with it. It just sits there and looks pretty. In Ultima 9, I can walk up to the barrel, and I can move the barrel around, and I can throw it into the water, and put stuff in it, and then throw it into the water, and there's a bit of buoyancy there. I can break the barrel, and I can take it to the barrel and make a staircase to climb somewhere that I shouldn't go.
Yes.
Yeah, lots of great stuff, and an excellent Ultima feature. Ultima 7 had tons of that. Ultima 6 had a lot of it. You can even find bits of it in Ultima 5. Ultima 8 had it. Why do you think these features weren't actively pursued by RPG developers working with 3D engines after Ultima 9? Because they went away.
I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The first and foremost reason is that when you have an object in a 3D world and you reach out with your virtual hand and take hold of it and move it around and drop it elsewhere, that's an incredibly stupid thing to put into a game as a developer, because you're creating a world of hurt for yourself. And that's what we did, was we spent endless hours recovering from that decision. It introduced all kinds of technical problems and all kinds of hurdles that we had to overcome. It was great, and it was so immersive. You're right. That was part of the diamond at the heart of Ultima 9, was that immersiveness and interactivity of the world. So that's one part of it, is just the technical Pandora's box that opens when you do that kind of thing. The second part is, let me try to describe to you, I've given this a lot of thought over the last couple of days since we chatted, and there was a Richard, who, by the way, I loved working with. He put a huge amount of emphasis on the world. He wanted this 3D world to be something that no Ultima player had ever seen. He wanted Britannia to come alive. And we did our best to do that. We had birds that actually flew out of trees and went and had a place for their nest, and they went and sat back in their nest. And we had just all kinds of cool features to make the world come alive. And the amount of effort that took robbed us of the ability to put in the other kind of more traditional RPG elements, like a party, like NPC schedules, like who owns what object, like crafting. Those were all things that Ultima 9 was missing, and those are things that ultimately, I think, add a lot more to the gameplay than the immersiveness of the world, I think. So we took a big gamble, and we really, put a giant amount of effort into that immersive world, and we created something unique. And I think that uniqueness is due in part to, it was just so ambitious, but it was also because other developers that came after probably more focused on the RPG elements, which in and of itself is a huge amount of development effort. There's my long answer.
Fair enough. And yeah, tying back to what you said earlier, I imagine that, if you were already dealing with, battling Windows for precious chunks of data storage, that, saving the state of this barrel, which I've now turned from one object into about 4, and moved each of those 4 pieces around, I can only imagine that, that whole caching in, caching out was just hell on earth to make work.
Well, yes, I have a great story for you now that you reminded me of this. One of the other things I worked on in the game was the hanging signs. And I don't know, let me call your attention in Ultima 9 to those hanging signs, because they're awesome. They started out as, it was just an example of something Richard wanted that was interactive. He wanted you to be able to kind of tap a hanging sign and have it swing, okay? And so I put in logic that just was a simple oscillation, and we looked at that and thought, that's terrible. And so I actually added physics to it. It exponentially decayed. And then I added like a little bit of a yaw element to it. And then we added wind, so that when there were multiple signs in the town and the wind blew, they would all blow and kick in and swing. And you could shoot an arrow into the sign, and it would react. to the arrow. I don't know if you ever tried that, but try it sometime. Shoot an arrow into a sign. Anyway, we had one of these signs that was swinging in the wind. And it was just at the edge of our, what we called the fast area, which is the area cached in around you that updates. And the area outside of that is cached down, is saved to disk. Well, this sign swung and crossed a boundary and dropped out of the fast area, saved to disk, and the little controller that was running it crashed. It was like, where's my object? So that was just one example of the kind of, oh my gosh, this game is unbelievably complicated.
That's funny. I mean, I knew there was always fun ways to make Ultima 8 crash, by, like, killing the avatar, and then he'd get deallocated just before, someone in the game came up and killed him.
Yeah.
Would kill the deallocated memory address and crash the game. But yeah, that's. I imagine that bug is probably still replicable in the shipped game.
Oh, we fixed it.
Oh, okay.
It was just really hard to find.
You mentioned Del Castillo previously, and one of the things, his treatment of the plot, his plan for the game, seemed to really focus on, sort of maximizing the use of the 3D engine. And in particular, there was one sequence I recall standing out from it where, and I mentioned this before, the Avatar gets imprisoned in the dungeon wrong. In the shipped game, he's responsible for his own escape, and then is met by Waven, and she gives him his equipment back. In this earlier revision of the plot, the plan had been to have the player actually take control of Raven and navigate through Dungeon Wrong, and it kind of would have been a bit of a, I guess, sort of a stealthy type sequence, lots of Tomb Raider-like acrobatics. Was support for that sort of gameplay ever really worked on, or did it get cut before the heavy coding started?
I think that concept was in at least up until at least 2/3 of the way through. I remember Ed had an idea that at different points in the game you could step into the shoes of different characters. Raven was only one of those. His idea and a version of the story at one time had you playing Lord British, which I think would have been awesome. Because you would have had access to these unbelievable spells, But that got cut. I think that marketing kind of poo-pooed that. They didn't like it. They didn't like the idea of you stepping into the shoes of another character. They thought it would be disorienting to the player or whatever. I don't think Richard was ever really that jazzed about the idea. And so that idea was really more of a table discussion. We had the ability to do it, but we just never went very far with it. And with the acrobatics and so forth, I don't really think we would have had high hopes of pulling something like that off. I don't really think so. We didn't go very far with that at all, if it was ever really a thing.
Okay. What about some of the other features that were kind of these come up actually a lot in the different bits and pieces of the different plot documents, whether it was the Bob White or Ed's plot. In-game events and features that, I mean, again, never made it to the shipping version of the game, but things like riding on dragons, armies meeting on the field of battle, stuff.
Those two particular features, I don't recall ever having actually been in the game. Riding on a dragon, I don't think so.
Like I say, I recall it coming up in different plot treatments. It was definitely floated as a sequence you would play through. But
no, I don't think that those ever made it in. There was a feature in the game that was going to be ship combat. The ship you had in the game, you were going to encounter pirates. That's kind of a staple of Ultima games, is having to fight pirates at sea. And we had the tech to do that, but we just didn't have the time, and we never had the art assets that were the actual pirates and pirate ship. Um, but that feature did come to bite us. If you want me to tell you the story,
Sure, if you have time.
let me close my door 1 second. My cat's being bad.
Oh dear.
He's getting rowdy. Um, so to support ship combat, before I had gotten there, they had uh, created the ship as an NPC. So the ship was not an object in the world; it was actually an NPC, and it had health and it had stats. And when we scrapped ship combat, we just kind of ignored those. It was like, well, we don't need that anymore, but we'll just leave it in because. Well, there was a point in the game where you went to an island that was infested with zombies, right, on your ship. And we get a call from QA, and they're saying, the zombies attacked our ship and it sank. And we're like, you can't. No, we never put that in. The ship can't sink. That's ridiculous. They're like, no, come down and look. And so we went down, and sure enough, the zombies were all swarmed over the ship that was slowly sinking beneath the waves. We're like, how can this be? And sure enough, there was old code in there that handled sinking your ship if it died. And the zombies were the only thing in the world that recognized the ship as an enemy, and they homed in on it and attacked it until it died. So that again, there was just so much stuff in that code. Good grief!
It was one of those features you mentioned that only came out during QA.
Right.
Oh man.
But yeah, regarding other systems that were cut, I don't know. There's just so much, but I think ship combat parties, NPC schedules. The list would be long if we were to actually go through everything that had been cut.
A lot of this focuses. A lot of what was cut seems to have been cut mostly for tech reasons. Was there anything that really got the axe more for artistic differences?
I'm sure there was. I wasn't really privy to a lot of those meetings and conversations. I mean, there were numerous discussions going on in design and in art, and so I'm sure there were things that were cut. Let me see. The only thing I can speak to that comes close to that is I observed the process by which conversations were being written. And so let me give you a little more history here. I know this is all about history, so it should be okay.
Yeah.
This is going to run long. Ultima 9, it had been restarted. We had ramped up. We had initially what looked like a fairly impressive head start, although we had a huge amount of tech debt built into the code. And EA came down and with the message, I think it was about midway through, where they said, we want this game to be the epic conclusion to the Ultima series. We want you to do anything you can to make this the most epic Ultima ever. So we started planning and we started scoping things and we started, down that path. And as we made our way down that path, there were problems and issues, and EA lost their will or whatever they do, and they decided to dial down the funding and just say, no, we're going to give you this amount of time, you have to ship on time, and we're actually going to take resources away from you. And so that happened. What was the question again?
It was more about anything that had gotten cut for artistic differences, but
conversations, we were so short on time and resource, and we were doing voice acting for the conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was literally one of the designers would script out a conversation, hand it to the voice acting director, who would get the actor to read the lines in like that day, and it was that tight of an iteration. There was no time for polish and no time for iteration. And so I think you can't really say that was a cut feature, but I would identify what was cut there was polish and iteration on the conversations. It was sacrificed because of the schedule time.
That's unfortunate, and that's one of the things that has kind of consistently come up in criticisms. I mean, I alluded to this when we chatted just recently, but there's this there's a game reviewer. He goes by the handle Spoonie. He does really esoteric game reviews is the word I'm going to choose to use there. There's a lot of ranting and raving, or really emotionally driven discussions of the titles. And Ultima 9 earned his ire in a very special way, unfortunately. And he devoted this, big three-part video rant to tearing it down some. And one of the things that unfortunately has kind of become popularized as a meme on the internet is the phrase "What's a paladin," which was his. He kept hammering that again and again and again during the game, as and I think it was. It really tied into that, right? Because I mean, the line in and of itself, or the inclusion of an option in conversation, so a new player who'd never played any other Ultima could learn what a paladin was, get exposed to that part of the lore, shouldn't have been controversial in and of itself. But certainly, the dialogue quality left something to be desired.
Yes. Yeah. Now, the specific line you're referring to, and the property of having introductory material in a game like that, I think it's important to do. And one of the concerns that EA kept reiterating to us is that the Ultima fan base was an ever-shrinking fan base, right? And they didn't want us to just cater only to that fan base. They wanted to just try and broaden the interest. And Richard was all about that. He was like, yeah, we want more people to have fun with our game. And so we were putting in material to kind of introduce people more to the virtues and the universe and so forth. But you're right. I mean, the lack of polish probably emphasized that as something that stuck out. And there were conversations that I really feel fell short. And I know that especially when you encounter the companions at the end, near the end of the game, they're not treated with the the dignity that they should have been. And that was just we didn't have the time, and that's a shame. We really, every step of the way on Ultima 9, the next thing we did was what we had to do. It was always driven by, we have to do this next, we have to do this next. And we never really got the chance to strategize and go, let's get our head above water here and see where we're trying to go. It was always, do this or die, do this or die. That was the way the development was.
Doesn't sound fun.
It actually was incredibly fun. It was stressful, and that aspect of it wasn't fun at all, but that game was one of the most fun games I've ever worked on. And I think the other programmers felt that same way. We had complete control over our render pipeline, even though it was suboptimal for Direct 3D. And there were so many things we were able to put in technology-wise that were just really challenging and fun. So we did have an enormous amount of fun with that game.
Well, that's good. I know when Mike talked about Ultima 8, fun didn't seem to be one of the themes that's carried through there. So it's good that at least Ultima 9, for as tumultuous as it was fun. Is there any part of the game, any specific thing that you can, a plot twist or gameplay element, something that if we've already discussed, your favorite thing, just mention it again, and we can, when I type out the transcript, people can refer back. But something that had to be cut that you really wish could have made it in.
I'm sure that there is. But I can't think of any one specific major thing. There were just, I think the party was a mistake to cut, and I think the NPC, the RPG detail of the game itself was something that we overlooked and sacrificed. And so I think I would say that is probably even above the party. Was just sort of the RPG-ness of that game. We missed. We omitted too much. There was, if I may go into another little bit of a story here about the culture at that time, because I think a lot of the fans have picked up on that omission of RPG elements. Um, at that time in Ultima Nine's development and in Richard's career, he was less interested in a pure, D20 Dungeons and Dragons style RPG. He was trying to do something different, trying to do something new. And he had vocalized this to us several times that he didn't want stats to be visible. And he didn't want levels and progression to be what the game was about. And that was such a different and weird concept at the time that we didn't really get it, and we felt a little lost at sea trying to make this game. Like, how do we do this? And so there was a de-emphasis on things like, one example is to build a fire. In a classic Ultima, you would need a tinderbox and a flint and a steel, and then you could build a fire. Well, that was viewed as tedium. Okay, and there is a degree of that could be tedious, but there's a degree of it that's fun, and so you got to find that balance. We just swung too far the other way. And if I may say, I don't think I've ever confirmed this with Richard, but the modern day incarnation of his idea, I think, is more fully realized in Skyrim. Skyrim is a game that your character really doesn't have stats. The stats are transitioned into the skill tree, but it's really you become what you do. And I remember he was really trying to do that in Ultima 9. He was trying to hide the traditional classes. You weren't a mage, you weren't a warrior. You did stuff and got experience based on that. So it would have taken considerably more iteration and time to breathe that to life. I wish we had, because it was certainly a revolutionary idea.
Yeah, that sounds like. And yeah, you're right. I mean, nowadays the concept of, the statsless, the stat-free RPG or the classless RPG. I mean, Richard's still pursuing that now with Shroud of the Avatar. It's essentially classless. There's a very comprehensive skill tree that ends the game. That sort of lets you, build out your character in the way that you want. But fundamentally within the game, you're an avatar. There's no fighters, warriors, mages, nothing like that. The one exception, I think, maybe within Ultima 9, the magic system was always really complex and arcane. In fact, it's probably the reason that I don't even I just straight fighter it through Ultima 9 most times, actually. I use spells only for where it's necessary to the plot. I don't think that's one of the questions I had penciled down, but it's kind of worth. I don't know if you had anything to remark on there.
I have a recollection of the magic system being something that was fairly new. But I don't recall specifics. I unfortunately can't help you with any insight into that. At the time, if I recall, I think we all thought it was really cool. Maybe we just didn't get it or whatever. Maybe it didn't come through. So
it harkens back to the Ultimate 8 system, to my mind. I mean, there's a lot of there are a number of differences there, but maybe it was just because so much of that code base had been brought over. Maybe that was just what was there and what was easiest to implement, rather than going back to like an Ultima 6 or an Ultima 7 style system. Anyways, Ultima 9, and we've mentioned this a few times. It had its share of bugs. Were there any in particular that you recall being particularly noteworthy, outside of anything we might have already discussed?
Sure. There are a couple of bugs that come to mind that are They didn't ship. We did fix them, I think, but they were hilarious. There was one bug where the way that our melee combat worked, again, this was an example of we made it technically harder on ourselves than it needed to be, but we put a contact point on the weapon. And as you animated in an attack, we would measure that contact point in 3D space to see if you were hitting your target. And that's how combat worked. And so if you were facing away from your target, of course you were missing. Well, that's needlessly complex. Why did we do that? And it also created a problem where in lower frame rate situations you could miss a lot more. You know, if there was this much angle between your sword animation frames versus this much. But the particular bug was there was a pirate out in the woods who decided his AI hated this butterfly, just hated this butterfly, and the pirate went after this butterfly, which had a collision presence of about a pinhead. And so this pirate was swinging and swinging at this butterfly, and the butterfly's just flapping around. And we just sat there and laughed at that for the longest time. That was great. The fix, of course, was to make the pirate not want to attack the butterfly. But the other bug was actually the best bug I've ever seen in any game ever. And it had to do with one day, one of my programmers comes in and says, "Bill, a dog just walked up to me and said, 'Hello, sir.'" And I was like, "You're joking, right? Whatever." Well, later that night, Todd Hayes and I were debugging the castle. Lord British's castle was notorious for performance, and we were trying to tweak the performance on it, and we're in the castle, and there's this archway, and we see a pair of feet in the air go past the archway. And Todd's like, they're walking on air again. I hate that. Because we had a lot of collision issues. And so we go into the room. They were not walking on air. They were flapping their arms and flying around the room. And we're like, what is this? What happened? And it was a weird flap, too. It was this kind of weird, weird thing. And they were flying around the room. We're like, oh, my God, what's going on? And we went outside, and sure enough, there's a dog walking upright, and he greets us. "Greetings, citizen." And here's what had happened. The save game had saved all the AI out in one order, and the logic to load it had loaded it in a different order. So when you saved your game, it basically scrambled the AI of everything around you. And we had guards who thought they were bluebirds, and we had dogs that thought they were people. And we died laughing. I mean, literally, we were just like, I think it was around 3 in the morning. We were crying. We were laughing so hard. We just went home. We're like, nope, doesn't get any better than that. We're just going to go home. And so we put a couple of homages to that into the game. I believe there was one version of the game that had an NPC down in the prison who thought he was a dog. I think there was, and I don't know if that shipped or not, but it had Richard's face on it. Maybe that shipped or not. The other is there's a tower off in the middle of nowhere where there's a guy named, I think, Melvin the Mad. Yeah, he flies around in his tower. He actually has a Bluebird AI, and that was our homage to that bug.
Well, that explains him, because, yeah, he's just out there. Yeah, I can still remember kind of where his tower is. It's not too far off of Britain. But
well, he actually had a lofty idea that he had a complicated spell that was a flying spell that he was working on, and we wanted to put the components for that spell around in the world in various obscure places. And if you actually assembled the spell, you would get the ability to fly around Britannia and go anywhere. And we wanted to get that in because it would have been super cool. Of course, you could have broken the game flying anywhere, but it still would have been. But we never had the time.
Oh, I admit I spent an awful lot of thought and effort trying to get those. There were those boots that you could wear during that one sequence in the Gargoyle City, Ambrosia. that would let you kind of fly. I mean, it was basically you were walking, but you were no longer bounded to surfaces.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I always wish that I could bring those boots out into the big world with me, but alas.
No, no, there's a reason why you can't do that.
Yeah. Although, when this is all done, I'm going to have to shoot you a link to. I don't know if you've ever read Doug the Eagle Dragon's interesting approach to playing Ultima 9 because he basically figured out, and I mean, he takes advantage of a few things in the engine, like the buoyancy, for example. Um, but, building himself a tower of staves and bread, he's able to build bridges across the expanses of ocean that otherwise you shouldn't be able to cross. And,
You can do that. Sure, you can. Yep.
and so, he's able to. But, the thing is, he's not interested in just breaking the game. He's interested in breaking it in a way where it can still be passed. Completely wrong, like in the completely wrong way, but still passed. I'll have to shoot you a link to that because it's hilarious, some of the stuff he does. Um, you mentioned Mike McShaffrey and sort of the Crusader engine and the iterations thereupon. I don't suppose you have any sort of Ultima 9 has gone through a lot of plot iterations. I mean, there was the final version, there was Ed's version before that, Bob White's version before that. Mike had his original pitch, and then I think there's actually one more at least that kind of fits in between him and Bob White. I don't suppose you would have had any knowledge about what that would have entailed.
No, no, I really don't. I remember I came on during near the end of Bob's time there, and I read his version of the story, and it sounded great. Um, but I know that his version went through. It just went through a lot of revisions until the final game didn't resemble it that much. Um, I don't know. It was a continuous blur of constant change and frantic running around trying to get things working. So I don't have any insight there.
No worries. And I mean, that may well have been lost to time because that was, even before the team had been seconded off to Ultima Online. Speaking of which, um, EA had this thing, and they kind of still do it today. Like we see it with the RPGs that BioWare cranks out, for example. Everything has to have an online component in it, even if it's Mass Effect 3, which is, very sci-fi, nominally single-player RPG. Dragon Age Inquisition coming out next week supposedly has an online element as well. Um, and at the time, that Ultima 9 was being developed, EA was kind of notorious for this. It's like, hey, you just produced the most successful MMORPG ever, and also the first, but the most successful ever. You are now the MMO. Was there ever any pressure to bring Ultima 9 online?
Um, there was. This is an interesting story. I'm trying to remember the time frame of this. This came from the marketing guys at Origin. I think they had concluded they couldn't sell this game unless it had multiplayer because all the cool kids were doing it. And they looked at me and said, "Hey, you did the multiplayer for C&C. Can you add multiplayer to Ultima 9?" And I said, "Well, it's software. You can do anything with time. We could add multiplayer if we had another year." And they said, "You don't have another year." And I said, "Then you don't have multiplayer." And it actually, basically, it was, "Well, can't we just do like a dungeon crawl, just something simple?" I'm like, "No, it's not the scale. It's just getting the networking in, getting that negotiation and the synchronization and the basics. Once you have the basics, yeah, you can shoot for the moon, but getting those basics in is many months of work. It's a different game. You have signed up to make a separate game when you say we're going to have multiplayer. Now you're shipping 2 games instead of 1. We don't need that. We're just trying to ship this one." And the executives started hounding us for it, and Richard was fighting them on it. But I will say, I'll give you another little bit of history here that probably no one ever hears. I've heard you mention Ed Del Castillo a number of times, and I get the sense that he's a person of interest in the community. He can be viewed as someone who's vilified a lot, I think. Um, and I don't really think that's fair. Ed Ed made some enemies while he was at Origin. He didn't pull punches, and he didn't play political games. He was just a no bullshit kind of guy. He also didn't build bridges. He wasn't a bridge building guy at that time. He was a friend of mine, and I'm largely responsible for bringing him onto the team. He and I worked together on CNC, and we needed a producer, and I kind of recruited him onto Ultima 9. One of the things that he did do well, though, was he batted away these senseless feature requests, like multiplayer. That was one that he put a lot of political cred on the line and said, no, we're not doing this, guys. We're just not. That's a stupid idea. and it was. It was just a terrible idea. Let's see. There was another one that came along where a mandate came down from nowhere that we had to build the source code for Netscape into our game. That's just another, you guys, it's a mandate. You will build the source code for Netscape into your game. We're like, what? Why? And what they were trying to do was have a web browser built into the game, which we also thought was incredibly stupid. Now, it was eventually that kind of thing would pay off. You could have help systems that were online and community ties that were online, but we did not need that in Ultima 9. Give me a break. And that was something else he kind of batted away. It was like, no, that's just a stupid idea. And so he was good at batting away those kinds of things, and he did have an interest in adding some of the action features into the game that really no one else had an interest in, but he didn't push that too hard, I don't think. He just had an interest in it. He had a lot of sparks fly between him and some of the other team members, and because of that, I think that he tends to be viewed as a villain, but I don't really think he was. And by the way, he was also a prophet, because as he was departing, he departed involuntarily. As he was departing, it was near the tail end of that time that EA was still giving us the line about, we want you to make an epic game. And Ed's final words to me, I think, as he walked out were, I care about this game. They're just going to shove it out the door. Unfinished. There you go.
Yeah, there you go. I have spoken with him, traded a few messages with him over time, and yeah, I think that's actually a really unfortunate period in games development. Not for what he wanted to do with it. I think what he wanted to do with it was actually really brilliant. But just he really has vilified a lot in the community, and that's unfortunate. Flip things around a little bit. You mentioned Richard a number of times. How directly involved was he? Was he directly involved in Ultima 9's development?
In the early part of my tenure there, he was intimately involved. He had a lot of opinions about what he wanted to see. He put a lot of emphasis on the interactivity of the world and the immersiveness of the world. We got that. He breathed that into us and imbued us with that desire. There were times during the later part of my tenure there when we were shipping that he was less involved. And you got to understand, I love Richard like a brother. But there were times that we were hurting for more of his involvement, and he had other obligations, and he had a lot going on, and a lot of other interests that he was pursuing too. And we could not have Richard as much as we wanted, and so. But overall, I remember his involvement as being pretty solid, just overall. And he really put his neck on the line for this product. There was a time when we had put a whole bunch of new tech in the game, and we hadn't had time to polish it or test it, and our performance was down. and that was at a time when he had to give a demo to EA, and the demo did not go well. And here's what I heard: they canceled it right then and there, and he put his neck on the line to keep the project alive. So,
So, given the chance, would you ever work with the man again, or on an Ultima game for that matter, should the opportunity arise?
I would love to work with Richard again. We both matured so much. I don't know if that would ever be possible. And working on an Ultima game again, I would definitely work on an Ultima game again. Ultima there's an inertia of legend behind it that could be the curse of a team if they tried to do another Ultima. But with the right team and with the right vision, yes, I think Ultima should live again. I don't necessarily think I should be the one who does it, but I would love to be involved should the opportunity arise.
I am just writing down that phrase, an inertia of legend, because
You get that, right? I mean, if you announced we're going to make a game, oh my gosh, the expectations.
yeah. Well, EA Mythic found that out the hard way. And I mean, to be fair, like those guys, okay, building Ultima for mobile is not necessarily the smartest decision because, again, it is a game with an established fan base that actually largely eschews mobile. Um, we talk now, we use categories like core gamers and hardcore gamers and casual gamers to describe the various segments of the gaming market. Um, and the people who know and love Ultima, I mean, they're not casual, most of them. They're core and they're hardcore, and the idea of putting Ultima on an iPhone.
It just isn't there.
But at the same time, leaving aside the fact that its freemium was not good, Ultima Forever was a game with a lot of love for Ultima and the lore.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that doesn't necessarily, love for the lore gets you somewhere, but it doesn't get you quite as far as you need, unfortunately, necessarily. You had mentioned that Richard had some other projects going on at the time, and I recall that around the time of Ultima 9, he was talking about this idea of a kind of a successor, kind of a spiritual successor to Ultima, a project that he only ever referred to as X. And he, I guess, had intended to kind of fold the Ultima 9 development team over into X whenever that was going to happen. Do you recall ever hearing anything about this? Do you know if it ever went anywhere?
I was actually on Project X for a time. There was a Project X. It lasted a couple of months. Yeah, he did have a desire to build a large, I believe it was an MMO. He didn't necessarily have a genre picked out, and he didn't necessarily have a story or even a gameplay style. What he communicated to me, and that's all I can speak to, is what he communicated to me and my peers was certain pieces of technology that he wanted to include. He had an idea for building a big virtual reality room that fans of the game could come visit Origin sometimes and go into this room and be surrounded by the world. And he was thinking big, right? I think Richard probably communicated that to EA, and they probably heard that, and they were like, no, we don't want to build a stupid big virtual reality room. And they weren't thinking big. They weren't thinking, this is for down the road, guys. This isn't the first thing we're going to do is build this room. But yeah, they weren't thrilled with Project X, and so Project X didn't last very long.
Pity.
Yeah.
I think I skipped a couple of questions here. Um, there was an unofficial. Okay, so I mean, there were a few patches released for Ultima 9. The last was 1.18, I think, was the last official patch that Origin pushed out. And then a little while later, this version 1.19 patch came along. And if I recall correctly, its two big things were that it removed the safe disk protection, or it did something with the safe disk protection to make it not so intrusive, and it helped with the D3D side of things. And the rumor is that someone at Origin, took the code home and basically built it in his spare time. You wouldn't happen to have any idea who that was, would you?
I recall after we shipped Ultima 9, which by the way there's a whole story to that. We can get into that later if you want. We shipped it. It went out. It didn't do well technically because of all the bugs, and it was such a problem that I lobbied to have a new CD made and mailed out to those who had purchased the game, and that was a bold suggestion, because that was an expensive proposition. And Carly Stalin, who was on Ultima Online at the time, she stood by me in this giant meeting filled with executives and said, yes, I think we should do that. And that's what they did. They mailed out that disc, and was that 118? I think
That was 118, yeah.
that was 118. I recall the dev team, a few of us, continued to work on the code while we were at Origin after that. And so that patch may have been born of that effort. If I don't think that EA had an official release of a new patch.
No, this was unofficial.
I do know the code. We continued to work on it afterwards. It wasn't that we took it home. It was we were at Origin working on it, and I have a vague memory that we made a new patch of it while we were there. I don't recall how that would have become distributed or anything. I think we tried to get the community management to release it to the community, so maybe that's how it went out. I don't know.
Okay. Well, you alluded to the story about the release there, and actually this one kind of leads into it. I mean, looking back now, a decade and a half after its release, what do you think your biggest accomplishment with it was, and what do you think your biggest regret with it was? And if you want to slip that release story that you alluded to just previously in.
Yeah, I think my biggest accomplishment on that game, while I'm very proud of the lighting, I think the lighting was beautiful, and I'm very proud of those swinging signs. My biggest contribution was that we shipped the game, because there was a lot of iron willpower that went into shipping that game against all odds, and I got numerous compliments, even from EA executives, after we shipped, that it was like, I can't believe you shipped that. I never thought it would make it. The fact that we did, and that I certainly had a role in that, I'm very proud of that. Now, having said that, shipping the game, I had been at Westwood, and Westwood had this golden period. I was happy to be there during that time where they shipped hit after hit. They never canceled a game at Westwood. And they, even if a game didn't do well, they saw it through to completion because they understood that the team learns from that. And you learn from failure. You don't learn from success. Mark my words. So when we were trying to ship Ultima 9, it was Ultima 9 was perceived as being in the way of Ultima Online 2. It was holding up Ultima Online 2's development. It was starving Ultima Online 2 for resources, and that's why they wanted to get it out of the way as quickly as possible. And so QA was under the mandate to get a playthrough from beginning to end with one continuous playthrough session. And they did it. It took a lot of work, but we did find bugs, and we'd fix a bug that would invalidate the save game, and they'd have to start all over at the beginning and go all the way through. But when we get that first playthrough, there was champagne broken out and everything, and there was a perception on the part of certain executives that, okay, we're almost done. That was a huge mistake. And I remember we were coming up on the Christmas deadline, and there was a fateful meeting in Jack Highstand's office. He was the general manager of Origin at that time. And we had the lead of QA and myself and a couple of other people there. And we had to make the call as to whether we shipped or not. And we looked at QA and said, is this a thing? Can we do this? And I believe that person said, yeah, it's going to be fine. And that was not the right call. It just wasn't. And prior to that, QA had been on a 24/7 work cycle. They had been working 12-hour shifts, it might have been 12 hours, 24 hours around the clock. And what that had meant was they were trying to get that playthrough in. They would start a playthrough, the first shift would end, the second shift would come in, and then about 2 in the morning they would hit a bug and they would call me. And I would drive into work. I'd get there around 3. I would look at the bug. I would identify, okay, which programmer needs to work on this, and then I'd call them in. They'd get in probably around 5. We would make a fix. We would make a new CD and get a new CD done around 7 a.m., and the whole thing would start all over again. And I remember endless nights of sleeping on that couch outside my office, and it was awful. And that fateful meeting in Jack's office where we were trying to decide whether we should ship it or not, the answer was there are too many bugs, but we were just too tired. It was just too awful. So it was a rough cycle shipping it. And it just didn't get the honor that it deserved from EA. It really didn't.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to summarize it. I mean, to be fair, I like the game a fair bit. I would probably prefer to play it to Ultima 7, if I'm really truly honest. Ultima 6 is still my favorite, though. But
that's completely fair. Completely.
anyways, you are now working at Blizzard Entertainment, aren't you?
I am.
So,
There's not much I can say about that because I didn't get full approval from the PR department to do this interview. I got approval from my manager, provided I can't discuss any Blizzard-related items. But I will say that what I'm working on is BattleNet. I'm a developer on BattleNet, and it's a thrill. It is definitely a high point in my career. I had thought maybe in the game industry my high points were behind me, and I'm happy to announce they are not. I love working at Blizzard, I love the people, and I love the company. So I'm very happy.
cool. And you had fun at BlizzCon.
Yes, BlizzCon, yep. Very fun.
Good, good. Well, that about brings us to the end of the list. I don't know if you ever engaged with the Ultima community kind of during and after Ultima 9's development and shipping. And if you did, I don't know if it was the most friendly place to be.
It has been. People have been resoundingly supportive. When they find out who I am, they're always happy to meet me, and that's just been really gratifying.
Cool. Well, that's good. If there was anything you wanted to say to the fandom at this point in time, what might that be?
I think I would say that Ultima 9 was not what any of us truly wanted it to be. We didn't get to finish our vision. We didn't get to see it through to completion. I think that there are, beneath the surface, you can see some of what it could have been. And so we will all just be left wondering together what might have been. And I will just summarize at the very end by saying, don't give up. Um, don't give up on Ultima. I would love there to be another one, and so please, I know everyone else would too. So don't give up. Don't let go of that.
All right. Well, thank you. This has been an enlightening discussion, I think. So thank
Very
you
well.
for taking the time to talk.
It's been a real pleasure.
All right. Don't go anywhere. I'm just going to kill the broadcast now, but hang out for a couple more minutes.